So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides. And I want to pick up right where I left off. So we were speaking about time and its relationship to the one and its relationship to being. And we're at the point where we've established, we're moving forward with the assertion that oneness partakes of time, or rather, that the one partakes of time. Now I want to read the last part of the previous paragraph that we were on. Parmenides asks, "But is to be simply partaking of being with time present, just as was is communion with being together with time past, and in turn will be is communion with being together with time future?" Aristotle responds, yes, it is. So the one partakes of time, if in fact it partakes of being. To that Aristotle responds, certainly. Now, our next paragraph, Parmenides says, of time advancing? Yes. So the one always comes to be older than itself, if in fact it goes forward in step with time. So we've just come off of this prolonged or long period by which we were describing how the one, being so pervasive, is found within all things. And there's this tension between understanding the one as an identity, which is the composite of two principles primarily, which is oneness and being, and they're unified, and by the expression of their unification, they give rise to identity. And identity is something that is a stable series, a stable arrangement of information such that it is intelligible. And so we've been discussing how this can occur at multiple layers, at varying degrees of sophistication. Much of our time has been spent on developing a grammar for identity formation. And our first phase is the determinate phase, in which we have very basic language to describe what the identity is. And this is like inside, outside, center, periphery, before, after, larger, smaller, all of these sorts of types of terms. But they're nondescript. We don't have any character descriptions. We don't have any property descriptions, or here and now descriptions. And so in my mind, I've been placing time at this sort of determinate phase, because as we're moving farther into this dialogue, we're expanding the determinate phase, and I'm expecting that we're going to move into the phase of properties and characteristics. But all along the way, I'm discovering that even within this determinate phase, if one thinks about it in any length of time, it's easy to imagine how complex things get very quickly, especially when we are considering how in our lexicon, this light cone, this expression of identity, which is an expression of a type or an angle of oneness and being of the one, we have such potential, such dynamic interplay between identities, identity states. And the introduction of time gives us this view of the constant change by which these identities are tasked to undergo. Now, the fact that we are approaching this point by which we are considering time in some sense linearly, there is an implication with what goes forward with motion. And although it's not really explicitly mentioned yet, it's an important component of this. The concept of time advancing is an interesting one. It brings all sorts of questions in my mind. I was struggling the end of last episode, trying to think about being in the present as only being as it is in time present, and in my mind I had this sort of arc, this trajectory of identity. At the beginning, at its outset, it has this fundamental essence that is more than just the expression of oneness and being, which of course binds it binds all things. And the essence is followed from the beginning to the end. The end is the point for which the identity that was is no longer coherent and cannot be reasonably intuited as it once was. So by time it's transformed into something new and different. And in the context of time, we think of advancement, we think of forward. And I want to be careful here not to attach to these words too many things that would get us too far afield. So, for example, when we say something like advance, it would be poor of us to attribute a word like good, or to that which is forward, to attribute goodness to moving forward. Because I don't think it's absolutely necessary that if one is to be moving forward, that it is a good thing. We could be moving forward in a negative context. Rather, I think what's most productive is thinking about if it is necessary to view time as a forward and advancing concept. There was a thought before that time was more of a field, much like the one is a field, but it's a field of that facilitates. It allows for motion to have an effect, not just forward, but also backward motion. And by relevance, if we are to remove ourselves from the equation, and where we mostly think about time as relevant as it moves forward, because as a being of limited time, or my identity rather, is limited in the field of time, that if we just saw it in terms of tomorrow, the time that we have remaining, or the time that is now, we would miss quite a lot. And although we sort of view our lives in this sort of forward arc, there are plenty of aspects about our lives for which we've moved backwards in terms of ontological orientation. We've progressed in terms of years and life. But there are so many other things that are variable for which time, even in the finite sense of our own being, it doesn't seem to really interact with us in that way. And so this broader concept of time I want to keep sort of in my back pocket, even if we are going to be talking about terms like advancing or forwardness as it relates to time. So let's go over this concept of the one. What does he say here? He says, so the one always comes to be older than itself. And we've gone over a few different areas for which the one is the same as itself, it's older than itself, it's larger than itself, it's smaller than itself, it's younger than itself. And this is as we compare the one to various instantiated forms of it, let's say, or expressions, angular expressions of the principles that define what the one as an identity is. So the one always comes to be older than itself, if in fact it goes forward in step with time. If it always goes forward in step with time. But much like largeness and smallness, we could have these instantiations be so variable across its, what we might call, progression. And so we can't say, like we do in time, that the one always becomes larger the more instantiated forms there are. This wouldn't make any sense. And I'm wondering now about the one as it relates to time and its progression. Is it always the case that the one is older in relation to time moving forward? If we have an initial condition, then I would say that yes, it is. But if the one is to be this pervasive field by which something can begin its participation with time, one particular instantiation of identity has now come to be, now it is something for a particular period, and then it ceases to be, and it's integrated into some other form or kind, whatever. The one in this way wouldn't necessarily be older than itself. The identity would be older than what's occurring. But the identity of itself wouldn't necessarily become older and older and older, but only if there were identities that existed for such a long time, like at the outset, of which this sort of creative impulse was necessary to give rise to what we see before us. But in absence of such a stable identity for such a long period, it doesn't seem to be as linear as we are exploring here. But this is a concept I'm not sure if we'll even get to. But to move forward with this. So again, Parmenides says, so the one always comes to be older than itself, if in fact it goes forward in step with time. Necessarily, says Aristotle. Do we recall that the older comes to be older than something that comes to be younger? We do. So, since the one comes to be older than itself, wouldn't it come to be older than itself that comes to be younger? Now this is exactly the type of language that I was hoping for, in the following sense. He says, do we recall that the older comes to be older than something that comes to be younger? So I'm thinking about two overlapping bell curves. I'm thinking one that has a much longer x-axis. The y doesn't really matter in this circumstance. Versus one that has a much shorter x-axis. And by this we can see the totality of their being as it is currently attended to, let's say. The essence is maintained. That identity is there, for one thing. The one that has started prior to the onset of the second is the one that is older. And perhaps in the case where I mentioned at the outset, where the x-axis is much longer, on the tail end, we really haven't gotten there yet. But in the beginning tail, this being before the shorter identity, then we can see the type of language that is being used here, because the point at which the curve begins is the point of coming to be. Now, the older is a contextual term. It is only older when we are comparing it to something else. And if something else comes to be after it, then it is obviously older. And he says, so since the one comes to be older than itself. Now, in what way, if we had to think about it in similar terms, would we then say that the older, or rather that the one comes to be older than itself? Because if it is itself, in the pure sense, then it would be one trajectory. It wouldn't be comparing another trajectory to the thing itself, unless there's different instantiations of the one. And so we can take any number of these, and we say that the one initial identity one is the oldest because of its point of conception, point of creation. Everything else is secondary to that. But I have to wonder, I still struggle, for whatever reason, with this beginning, this initial condition of the one, the initial identity. Now, on one hand, when we think about the arc of what I've been describing, we have these sort of microcosms that flow off of the main channel of the first iteration of that expression from the one. But it's not reducible to, I think, like a pure repetition, because the field opens up possibility. The one itself is not the possibility, let's say. The expression of the one is the possibility. And all of the uniqueness that occurs thereafter is because of that expression. So initial condition of the one, in some sense I'm struggling with this earlier and later, the linearity dynamic. Perhaps because I want there to be a stronger image of time than my sort of linear experience of it. So I have to be a little bit careful. But maybe there's both things that we can consider. That time has this linear aspect to it, for which we have associated terms like earlier and later, before and after. Well, before and after may not necessarily be linear in the way that uh, some other terms might be. So I get lost so easily in the variability of things. I So I'd like to take a second just to think more about these terms. It's going to be a bit painful to pick at this, but I think I need to do it. So I've already mentioned earlier and later, the sense of before and the sense of after. Much like many relational things, there's a context that's necessary. There's a point of attention that's necessary. In order for something to be earlier and later, there has to be something that it is related to. Otherwise, saying that the one is earlier doesn't make any sense. What is it earlier than? What is it later than? And then we can ask questions of how is it later, how is it earlier? And perhaps the how of early and late may not necessarily be strictly linear. Because where my mind goes here is this sort of interconnected, potentially overlapping series of identities as they were, and perhaps as they are, but have at one time had being to them in a particular instantiation. The how of this as it relates to time is, I think it's still related to time because it discusses the dynamics of change from initial condition to final condition. Now within the initial condition and final condition, we do have this linearity. And I wonder if we could for a moment think about something for which its identity has ceased, but then reemerged somewhere later. So there's an initial condition, ending condition, and then another initial condition. And yet this thing, as it reemerges, how could we say that it is the same thing? Can we say that it is the same thing? If we do say that there's enough similarity that it's sort of a continuation, then what does it mean to the shape, the geometry of this sort of bell curve analogy for which there's this height of the expression of a particular identity, and then it tails off as things change, as boundaries are shifted, and the fundamental components of it are increasingly separated, dissolved, transmitted, whatever the case might be. In the situation, and I know an example that I'd like to share, but in this situation, it would seem as though that there is a sort of a dimensional shift in the sense that our basic conception of how we were measuring time is not sufficient. There's like a measurement tool behind the tool that we use to measure this sort of this bell-shaped graph for the expression of an identity. And if I say that there's something behind that, well, what does that mean necessarily? And I think what it means, much like we were talking about this progression from the determinate layer to something that approximates a farthering of this determinate field meaning that determinations can be quite basic, and then we can move into this complexity landscape. And then once we have a sufficient orientation, we could then think about complex identities and simple identities as it relates to character traits and properties, and particular here and now instantiations, ultimately. And I think that there are some physics examples by which we can identify particles and things that sort of pop into this observational frame and then pop out of it, whatever that means. I have this sort of vague understanding of this sort of thing. But the thing I think that represents this idea the best is the spiritual domain. And there's one spirit in particular that is quite easy, I think, to reflect on, and that is the spirit of liberty. The spirit of liberty is something that may become absent in a society, and yet as a potential and as a possibility, as a recurring theme, it returns to the human experience. Part of me wonders, where does it go when it's exhausted? Is it truly exhausted? And I say that it's not truly exhausted in a sense, but there's a fundamental maybe type of identity, or type of identity, but type of liberty that is particular to my meaning. Now, this spirit has to do with the individual and the individual's relationship to the institutions, other people, and more broadly, the collective experience of the society, of the civilization, and of the institutions. I mean to include all of them. There are civil, or ecclesiastical, corporate, all of these. And it can be quite a slippery spirit unless we reflect on specific instances. Perfection is not something I think we need to seek here. We'd always be disappointing ourselves if we were aiming for a pure perfection. But it's easy to see the spirit of liberty in the Magna Carta, for example, in the American Revolution. It's easy to see how the spirit of liberty is seen in this dialogue. An ancient Greek dialogue. There are plenty of societies that have had periods of liberation. The specific type of liberty, though, is righteous liberty, which is distinct from a type of liberation that is fought hard for and won, but is unjust, and that what a person is liberated from actually unstabilizes their ontology rather than improves it and harmonizes it with the things that are around it. But back to the general idea, the general theme. What happens to the spirit, the righteous spirit, when it finds itself not expressed in the common orientation of man's experience? would we say that it pops in and out of existence? Much like some of these particles? I suppose on one hand we could say that. But I don't think that would be sufficient. We can make an argument that everything is based on these probabilities. That the fact that there is a human civilization, the fact that we struggle and wrestle so much with attachment and detachment, of liberation and of constraint, or of conservation, it would seem likely that all sorts of repeating patterns of the spirits would emerge in this sort of environment for which it is likely for it to occur. And that we could say in one situation where the spirit of liberty is exhausted, the righteous spirit of liberty is exhausted, that this happens in human experience. There's no guarantee that it will come back, but given the parameters, it's likely to reemerge. The light cones are oriented in such a way that would facilitate its its expression. And I'm sympathetic, I think, to part of this view, but it's not the total of that view. I go back to more of the mystical side, mystical for a moment, because I don't think I want to keep something unresolved, but in the sense that we were thinking about a potential situation in which the righteous spirit of liberty is extant and then goes extinct, that there's an end to its particular instantiation. Is there a place that we would go to that is behind the narrative, meaning that it's behind this sort of graph of the life of liberty, how it traversed through the minds of men, through their institutions, through their hearts, and found its home, and also found its destruction and its decay. Now, when we think about identity landscape and the fullness of it, not just one layer, I think it's safe to say that identities emerge based on their relations to other identities. All things require relationships. If they didn't have relations, then a number of things would occur. For an identity to not have relation, for it to be disconnected from everything else, I think would necessarily lead it towards absence. If you just give something being to start with, and then you get rid of all of the associations, it would become something that is dissociate. And what internal coherence it would have would in time cease to be. Now, why is this the case? I think it's easiest to see in our world, let's say. I've used this example before. I think there would be some hang-ups after I'm done with this analogy, but the analogy of the city, for example, it would cease to be if the gates were closed all of the time, because it would cease to have an inflow of goods, perhaps an inflow of personnel, an outflow of waste. If the gates were open all of the time, then the possibility would be that there would be such a potential for foreign influence or pathogens to enter into that city, that the city's identity would be destroyed. Maybe it's taken over, maybe it's physically destroyed, whatever the situation is. And so there has to be this inflow and outflow of information in order for it to be maintained. And I think that this scales to all things. And we could say, well, we could put something in a vacuum and it'll keep. You throw something into outer space and it's not going to degrade or change, really. Well, if it didn't degrade or if it didn't change, it wouldn't be subject to time, I would say. And it's not to say that there are identities, there are identities that are resistant to change, but are still subject to time, let's say, or are still influenced by time. But going back to this analogy of, let's say, the rock that's in space, that's not subject to really any forces other than the basic laws, it's still associated with on one hand determinate features that define it, and if we were to go back to our city analogy about the inflow and outflow of information, eventually there had to have been a situation in which information flowed into a system from somewhere else to create that thing. So while it may now be in a state of relative individual coherent expression and stable, long-term stable coherent expression, it was not always that way. And it will not always be that way, because a thing cannot sort of cut itself off and be a purity without abandoning difference and abandoning the expression of oneness and being. And eventually, this rock will come into contact with something else, maybe physically. Maybe there's some underlying physical, from a physics standpoint, there's an underlying anatomic orientation, however this might play out, such that the composition of the rock has changed, it's altered, its identity has changed. Now this may take a long time, of course, but nonetheless change will come to it. So why am I here? Well, we're trying to determine if time, its influence and change, as all identities are sort of influenced by this, and that there's a beginning and ending to things, that there can be an aspect or a type of relation among identity such that the first pass, the first level, or the initial level, whatever we want to call it, I'll call it the human level, the human perceived level, that this is just one type. This is one type of instantiation. And in fact, there are others. And in the spirit of liberty in particular, it's an interesting case. And I don't want to deny those situations for which information is distributed, shared, and coherent things are made to be incoherent, and then down the road, coherence of something else is now established into a new identity. This is happening all the time. I don't think that that's any sort of secret, and I don't mean to suggest by my ramblings about something deeper that this is not something that occurs. Of course it does. But with our example of the spirit of liberty, this is something that I think because of the environment, taking one of our prior explanations that I found did not suffice. I think because of the environment and the types of relations that take place, and because of the probabilities and the possibilities therein, but not restricted to those probabilities, that what is maintained is perhaps what I'll call, in this case, a fundamental essence. But with the emergence of this term, I think we have to keep in mind another previous exercise. And that exercise of the rock thrown into outer space indicates that change will likely come to it. Fundamental change will likely come to it. And so we are in this place where we have these tiered and layered structures by which the likelihood of a particular identity from expressing itself is more likely. We also have a situation in which we can say that all things are subject to change. Pure unities don't exist. Only relational components. And today happens to be a new day. And like always, a new day brings new thoughts. And so I like to regather my thoughts and then approach this anew. It might have to do with getting back into this dialogue. Much of that last little series was sort of a free-form, non-dialogue exposition or exploration. So, going back to Parmenides, he says, of time advancing. So the one always comes to be older than itself, if in fact it goes forward in step with time. Necessarily, says young Aristotle. Now I'd like to sharpen some of our definitions and perhaps change our conception of a couple fundamental things that we've been discussing thus far. On the fundamental layer, I want to make sure that it's understood that I may use this language interchangeably, but I mean it in only one way. That the bridge of coherence is coherence. Oneness is defined not by its expression, but by its coherence. The expression is secondary. When we think about time, I think we have to move towards not just the expression of the oneness as something being measured, as an identity that's separate from the identity of the one. I've been trying to get away from this. I have the mirror image in which it's sort of this hypothetical purity. And I have this hypothetical purity compared to the angular expression of oneness. But then we are stuck with the dilemma of having differing identities from that of the one. And for the longest, I've been considering that the one has been, it's only really possible to say that it's younger or older than itself if we take the self and we expose it to a type of difference, which would make sense in the articulate angular expression of the one. But it's not precise. It's not itself. I think there's another way in which we can think about it in terms of itself. From the mirror image, we have the idea of pure self-sameness. But if we have itself only in the mirrored sense, we don't have the articulate order any longer. The statement older than itself becomes impossible. The mirrored self admits no internal asymmetry. When we have itself in the articulate sense, in the articulate temporal sense, only in that sense, then we have the risk of it becoming too differentiated. No internal coherence, no ground. So we need aspects of both of them. The grounded sameness, that makes it one identity, and some differentiated unfolding, which we might describe as temporal in nature. And so what we have from this is not an identity that is compared to itself in the mirror, nor do we have an identity, the identity of the one, that expresses itself in many different ways, or rather I should say that the expression of coherence of oneness and being into different identities, different articulated orders, that this cannot be reasonably attributed to the identity of the one, but rather its expression, its field of influence. The identity of the one itself, if it is to participate with time, then we are afforded an interesting opportunity to see the identity of itself as time advances, or as the snapshots of time, let's say, offer a reflection that is not purely reflexive. It's not purely a mirrored regurgitation. It is something that is real. It is something that within this field of influence that's offered by time, we are offered different segments by which we can appreciate the one. Now, it may very well be the case that the one doesn't change, and that's fine, but it's not, its unchangingness is not because of a pure unity. It's because its unification is stable, and its coherence is so fundamental to the order of articulate things and of identity formation that it must be that way. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So today happens to be a Friday evening. And time has been going by quickly lately. And we're about to enter into April in a few days. And so this sort of undulating, cold and tolerable warmth from the 30s to the 60s that we've been experiencing is going to gradually become warmer and warmer, and the trees will give rise to their leaves, and the landscape will appear a bit differently. It'll appear more abundant, vibrant, alive, and we'll have greater opportunities to sit in the sun and to enjoy that side of things. And with this, I think, comes thoughts of joy and plans of things to engage in. But also it's a reflection on the future and what that potential future holds. And there are many things that are both short and long of my vision that I see graspable, possible. If only I did the basic step of reaching out and grabbing it. Of course, it's easier said than done. Now, this is not some melancholic reflection. This is a recognition of opportunity and a desire for achieving something that means something. We've, I think, found ourselves at a particularly interesting place. We are still deep in the weeds. And although there is this desire for some conclusion by which things would become clear in an instant, all of the things line up and everything just works out, that will not be the case for the future. The future is one in which gradual improvements will take place. Short-term goals will be met in view of long-term ones. Goals will be adjusted. Failures will come. Successes will come. That's all a part of experience and of trying to be better. But we found ourselves in an interesting place now that we are reflecting on time, one of the fundamental things of our experience. Just a moment ago, the expression was, I feel as though time is speeding up lately. I thought about it at work the other day. The last 3 Fridays seemed to have come and gone so quickly. That last Friday seemed to feel like it was as it is now. And part of me has to wonder if this is not a consequence of the speed at which the speed at which rumblings are occurring within our societies and on the earth more generally, or if it is just a consequence of getting older, and perhaps both are true. But time is a funny thing. There's often the expression that time is relative. And if we say that time is relational, I don't mean to restrict the term, because I think that where we have been is a little bit more than just calling time relational. But nonetheless, the view of time as relational is an interesting one, because we think about relations and their effect on time, or vice versa, time's effect on relationships. We've been quite focused on the singular of the identity and thinking about its trajectory over time, its sort of life trajectory, regardless of what that thing is. We've been floating around ideas of these interconnected spheres of information. And I say information more generally. We can use other words like multiplicity, plurality. It's an identity of vagueness, and yet to be made solid, unified, concrete, singular, in a sense, identifiable. So getting back to Parmenides, he says, so the one always comes to be older than itself, if in fact it goes forward in step with time. Now we've made our new cut into the participation of the one and everything else, but in particular time. And we say that there is this relationship such that the one itself, as an identity, is sort of traveling within this place, within time. I've often associated movement with time to break myself from the linearity of it. Although I do think that the linearity provides us with good images, so it's one measure by which we should approach our definition of the term time. But also, I think thinking about it in terms of motion, unfolding from one point to another. Because, of course, it's not just a static experience of identity that identity inhabits. It's a dynamic one. And so that dynamism, I think, needs to be measured by something. If we give it something like time, okay, we have this term for it. But how does it look? How does it unfold? Now, I suppose a good counter-argument would be, well, you're giving motion to time, why don't you just say that motion is the thing that is causing the motion, and then time is something else? And I think that that's a good point. We would have to describe and discuss the relationship between motion and the motion, time, and the relationship to the one. But I think perhaps there's something a little bit more simple than needing to undergo that exercise, which I think might be useful, but maybe not necessary. So the way in which I see time as motion, I think may be secondary, because we can't say it's a motion itself. It's motion itself. I think I'm saying emotion for some reason, but motion itself. Much like the one offers this landscape by which the seeds of difference can express itself, time is this broader category by which motion can emerge. Now, what are the constraints that allow this to be? And I suppose that we would have to be thinking about what motion is if we were going to think about what time facilitates, or at least discovering what motion is will give us a better insight into the other piece of that puzzle. So the limits of motion. Now, there's one sense of motion in which we have something that is moving over a distance. This is still a dimensional quality. I don't think that there's anything wrong to describe things in this way. I think it's needed. Movement is something that is contrary to something that is rest. That something at rest is in one place without some other force acting on it. And given that we're in this dynamic environment, there's always something acting on something else. And so rest is more, again, of a relative term. Absolute rest, I would have to wonder what that would look like. Much like some of the terms that we've described in the determinate landscape and named them relational terms, it seems that rest is one of those. Motion, on the other hand, seems to be something of an innate state. That we can ask ourselves, well, if we only had the identity of the one and its expression of coherence between its parts, then what reason would there be for anything to become more or different than that which already is there, that basic three-part structure. And the answer to that, I think, is difficult. I'm not really sure I have a good one, at least at this point. Not rationally, I should say. But we do have this concept without attributing purpose to it, which I think is a necessary step given underlying beliefs and frameworks. But again, trying to stay disciplined and following this dialogue. This motion is an aspect or an association of identity formation that is undeniable. And that given all that we have discussed in the Proverbs and in the Psalms about the inside and the outside of an identity, that what's inside the identity depends just as much on the outside as the outside depends on the inside of an identity. The outside is not just some obscure, formless thing. It may be more multiplicitous. It could be quite unified. If one city abuts a different state or another people's, for example, kind of a bizarre situation that would be without conflict, but nonetheless a possibility. That if we take away just for a moment the frailty of man's condition and the mistakes that he may make within his own collective gatherings, the inside and the outside of his situation, in view of survival and in view of justice, he has to be honest with himself about those things that are true that he does not know, so that he can better participate in the environment and become successful. Now, this is a bit of an evolutionary case, but it doesn't need to be thought of that way. Well, let's hold off on that type of language. I don't think it gets us anywhere. But the reason I bring this up, about this inside and the outside of the self, of the city, and all of this, is because if we take this to be sort of a microcosm of a broader principle, the broader principle being that identity formation, and also maintenance, also identity destruction, or transformation, maybe that's a better word, all relates in some way to this sort of net exchange of information. It could be good, could be bad, it could be beneficial to the identity, it could bring about its change more rapidly, it could bring about change. I mean, the change could be a beginning, it could be an ending, it could be a maintenance. Where change, in the case of maintenance, would seem contradictory, but change in the sense that it's not self-referring or self-reverential. And in this way, the change is enough newness is brought into the system to prevent it from collapsing in on itself. Whereas the complete self-purity, if the individual or the town was to do such a psychotic thing, would it be to bring about a starvation, literal starvation, because there's no outside influence. This is kind of an easy one to see. But also I think of the individual that isolates and that does not participate in anything but their own base desires. Without challenge, without change, things become stagnant and absorbed in that selfish cloak that blinds the eyes to things that are grander, maybe, better. Now, Parmenides continues And he says, do we recall that the older comes to be older than something that comes to be younger? We do, says Aristotle. So since the one becomes older than itself, wouldn't it come to be older than a self that comes to be younger? Necessarily. Thus it indeed comes to be both younger and older than itself. Now I want to discuss the first part of that. Do we recall that the older comes to be older than something that comes to be younger? Now at first glance, it seems to be obvious that this is the case. But what is also obviously the case in my mind is that I have no good image for what that actually means. I just sort of have this vague notion of understanding of what it means. And it really wasn't until I started thinking about it that I understood that I had a vague notion of what it meant. Now the dangerous thing about this sort of thinking, I feel like, is that it can permeate into so many other areas. And it penetrates into things that one questions that one probably ought not to question if one is to live a life that is that flows well. That if everything is always up for this rational exercise, then I wonder about the danger of the self's desire to achieve some intellect, because at some point it struggles to participate in life, in rich aspects of being. The irony, though, on the other hand, is that oftentimes the exploration itself is the thing that leads to the expansion of a better experience. And I suppose it matters where it's placed, like a strategic injection, a strategic time to act, such that the capacity to exercise that part of the mind is there when needed, but also is willing to take a step back and let things go, and hold on at a resolution that is lower than that which is desired. Maybe that's just an unfortunate quality of my mind, I'm not really sure. And perhaps I think so superficially all the time that I'm always in this mode of being pulled to understand better, but I passively reject. I'm not really sure what the situation is, but I do know that there, in my mind, are these two states. One that's more general. It takes things, I don't want to denigrate the word faith, but it takes things on a particular plane of faith, such that we give up that which we don't know in the particular, and we trust that things will the language here is difficult, because I want to say be stable. We'll trust that they will be there, that there is a way, that there is goodness. I think this is a little bit far ahead of the skis, but I think it's important to say. Otherwise, as I mentioned before, we run into this dilemma for which, as we speak about time and we speak about the change and transformation of identity, which I think is one of the foundational aspects of time, that the way in which this goes really depends on the key points at which we exercise motion. And it would seem that if we exercise motion in time, what we are doing is directing the change in identity, which is afforded by time, in a manner that we think the thought is itself based on certain things. Maybe it's based on selfish desire. Maybe it's based on a higher order, a higher logos. Perhaps it's based on a truth or a falsehood. Or perhaps maybe it could be said of most things, if not all things, that it's a combination of the two, that we have these beliefs, we have these desires. They may be elevated, they may be low. But all the same, this motion, the purpose-infused motion, is directed into time, and we change our own being, our ontology, as time progresses. As I sit here and speak into this microphone, am not the same person as I was 10 years ago. There are elements that are similar, sure, but very different. So when we think about the older coming to be older, something that is younger, I think about this big or large map that we have so far. In the sense that it is not just lifespan and ending. There's this large expanse of things that are happening almost concurrently. But they're not concurrent in a particular linear view of them happening. And because it's not this sort of straight linear view of them happening, we can see clearer how the older is actually older than the younger. Now, with regard to motion in time, what we see is the potential for directionality. We see not just x and y, we have sort of the perpendicular to these in a space that has a greater dimensionality to it, that there are more planes by which something can move into. Even in a basic, reduced two-dimensional frame in which we have these two x and y, we have all of the degrees that are between the two 90-degree, or the two planes that create this 90-degree angle. And we have this whole planar episode that occurs between the two at varying degrees. And at each one of these degrees, we have different interactions, different possibilities, different orientations, different orientation of information, different shared information, different types of transformation that are undergoing. And, of course, within this landscape, we have things that are, things that were, and things that come to be. And it can't be stressed enough at the entry and exit points, the entry to our city. At this point in time, this side of the city wall means this, whereas this side of the city wall means that. Inside, outside. Determinate landscape. We have big, we have small. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now, yesterday was an assured, poor, and limited day with regard to productivity. It's something that I regret. But new days bring this newness of experience. Like we've been talking about with the entry point of a particular existence of an identity, we have this beginning period, the initial condition. And this is what a new day or a new segment of the recording feels like. It's an opportunity to move forward. Now, earlier today I was thinking that I've been spending a lot of time on these two paragraphs. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's important. We're slowly expanding our idea, this image of reality, as it seems, floating around ideas, some perhaps more coherent than others, but all the same experimenting, going back to the text and getting new ideas, new information by which we could spin up another exercise. Some exercises are admittedly, from my standpoint, not as useful as others, but nonetheless, as long as there is something that is done and there is that effort that's put forth, I think that's what is important. Now, Parmenides says, so since the one comes to be older than itself, wouldn't it come to be older than itself that comes to be younger? So I want to reintroduce the image into my mind of this idea of the one being exposed to the influence of time, such that its identity, although stable, is going to be slightly different from one point to another. Even if the only difference is that it is separated by time, through which the change of various other identities take place. And here I pause for a moment because I'm thinking about our definition of time. And from what I remember, we were coming to this idea of saying that within time, change is possible, and then there is this relationship of movement that is also present. And now this relationship of movement with time, we separate it out, so motion is not the same. It's not equivalent with time, but it's related to time, I think, in the sense that time affords movement. In the sense that as we see changes occur, movement is one of those undeniable expressions that attends the transformative process or the process of change. I think from one point to another, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of this dimensional aspect by which, because of the interaction among identities as motion continues, there is this aspect of observance that respects and acknowledges the interactions themselves, I guess. The interactions themselves, I'm trying to get at something deeper than just change. But, of course, when we look at change, what we see is an exchange of information. We may see an enhancement of some physical body. We can say that something is larger or smaller than another. We can use any of our determinate terms by which we recognize this as time having some influence on a particular identity. And he says, thus it indeed comes to be both younger and older than itself. But it is older, isn't it? Whenever in coming to be, it is at the now time between was and will be. For as it proceeds from the past to the future, it certainly won't jump over the now. No, it won't, says Aristotle. So I wonder what to make of this. It's simple enough to understand on one level. That there are plenty of states that even as we reflect on the one as it is now, as it currently is, it is leaving behind all of these states, these previous states in time. And it continually comes to be. As I see, there's this generative experience by which we can identify it is as it is. Identify it as it is. Now the interesting part is when he says it certainly won't jump over the now into the future, let's say. And so we have this idea of taking an identity state and saying that it's younger than itself. We have an idea of taking an identity state that is older than some point in the middle, and then we have our now. The now, as it would seem, cannot be older than itself. He says, doesn't it stop coming to be older when it encounters the now, as we've said? It doesn't come to be, but is then already older. Isn't it? For if we were going forward, it can never be grasped by the now. A thing going forward is able to lay hold of both the now and the later, releasing the now and reaching for the later. While coming to be between the two, the latter and the now. So I want to center the mind on this progression. It's quite linear in terms of where we are. And so we have an identity, we're thinking about it going through time. Younger, now, older, before, now, later. We have this concept of now space in which an identity is, that it cannot be older than itself, as it is in the now. It can be older than itself as it was. What this brings into question is this vague image of the interactions among things at the margins, at the borders. And what do I mean? Let's just say there are packets of information. The packets of information we can call identities in and of themselves, because they have parts, there's a boundary around the packet, and they interact with other things. And then we have, since we're already at the margin, I'm thinking about two other larger identities. And these distinctions seem to come into contact with each other. And I'm thinking about this in the context of time, and in particular, what Parmenides had just said about the now reaching forward into the future, being sort of in between this now and the older, the potential older than itself of the now. And as these interactions unfold, we see that what we have is the tip of the spear. The information that is interacting with another environment. I don't want to get too far ahead in this exercise, but I think it might be necessary. So we imagine our hypothetical packets of information as they are, for whatever reason I think about cellular communication here, but it doesn't have to be this way. But these packets of information are being moved from one area to another. And it's not just moving, the motion, which is important. It's also the information that it carries. The information is purposeful, it has a particular direction or motion of its own, and it has a particular relationship to the identity that it was born of, let's say. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's an invading force, but it is a force that has a particular relational quality to it. And as it is moving to the border of another identity, regardless of what that border entails, regardless of how restrictive or open it might be, there is going to be some relationship that happens there. And at the now, and all of the points in the past, we begin to see this unfolding movie of identity mechanics. Some perhaps significant, others perhaps insignificant. And as this packet of information comes into contact, the information itself agreeing or disagreeing with the motion that it comes to intersect with, perhaps agreeable, perhaps disagreeable, perhaps it is penetrating, perhaps it is repulsed. There's all sorts of different ways in which this can play out. Of those that are significant, let's say, in the cases in which there is a profound effect, maybe on both identities, if something occurs at the boundary of one that changes its motion, changes its orientation, to be similar or to be drawn to the identity that it is coming into contact with, on one hand, our harmonious relationship, this is particularly relevant in the human context, is one in which the identities, the poles themselves, remain stable, but they exchange intimate information. And by this exchange of information, there is sort of an identity of relation, a third party that takes place. Much like with the coherence of oneness and being in the one, we have the coherence of one identity in another. The parts are stable, and there's a coherent unity that takes place. In all of these previous identity states that were before, that we say that the now is older than, there comes a point at which we say there is a new identity, perhaps, one that is composed of these two larger units, these parts now. And what defines their boundary has now changed, though their individual boundaries may relatively stay the same. And again, I want to emphasize that this can play out in a million different ways. The parts themselves can be transformed into new identities before the coherence even takes place. We can have the opposite effect, in which there is a destruction of both identities, and they move out into more of a multiplicitous type of experience. And in this case, the comparing of the older and the younger, it would become complicated. In the case of a dissolution or of a reunification or a new unification, our point of reference shifts. And now the thing that is itself begins anew. At the point of new creation, perhaps there's a point at which we could say that it cannot be older than itself, but older than itself in what it used to be. A sort of memory of time as it goes forward. Parmenides says, "But if nothing that comes to be can sidestep the now, whenever a thing is at this point, it always stops its coming to be, and then is whatever it may have come to be." So we're at the now, and we're going to pause at the now, hypothetically. And we can't get past it. And in this sort of imaginary state, there's really no going anywhere. I think the potential is there. And I think this is why he says, and then is whatever it may have come to be. Well, actually he's saying this because at this point, we're thinking about all the previous states of its instantiation. But I don't know. I think we can see it in both the same. And he says, and then whatever it may have come to be. So it indicates a possibility, but also it indicates, I think, the previous states of coming to be, the younger states. So too, the one, whenever in coming to be older, it encounters the now. It stops its coming to be and is then older. So when we say it stops its coming to be, I have to think that we are taking a snapshot, one section, or we're just saying hypothetically we're stopping time at this point and now it is just the now. An impossibility would seem more likely to reflect on the previous states of being. And here it's obvious to see how we would find the older. By reflecting on where the now is and the identity point relative to that point, both in the older and the younger. So it also is older than that very thing it was coming to be older than. And wasn't it coming to be older than itself? And the older is older than a younger? It is. So the one is then also younger than itself, whenever, in its coming to be older, it encounters the now. Necessarily, says Aristotle. Yet the now is always present to the one throughout its being. For the one always is now, whenever it is. No doubt. Therefore the one always both is and comes to be older and younger than itself. So it seems. Now there's a part that I think I'm just not grasping here about nowness. There's this experience of hitting the now, and by this we have our younger. When we hit the now, I think what we have in the fullness of time is something to be said about the relationship of the one, maybe not just the one, but identity in general. The term relative comes to mind here, not in the sense that the pure relative, in the sense of an inability to determine that which is true, or the impossibility of truth, but rather the sort of undulating expressions of nowness, and then the change of the previous states relative to the position of now. And so there's like this internal time, it would seem, to the identity itself, or of the one itself, in which we say both itself is younger and older than itself, its now will eventually become younger than something that is older, but its now is also something that it is something that is older than that which was, that is younger, and it is also something that is older. It's also something that is younger than something that is older, depending on its place. Yet the now is always present to the one throughout its being. For the one is always now, whenever it is. Therefore the one is always both is and comes to be older and younger than itself. Is it, or does it come to be, for more time than itself, or an equal time? An equal, says Aristotle. But if it comes to be, or is for an equal time, is it the same age? Doubtless. And that which is the same age is neither older nor younger. No, it isn't. So the one, since it comes to be, and is for a time equal to itself, neither is nor comes to be younger or older than itself. I think not. So beginning with the first sentence of that paragraph, is it or does it come to be for more time than itself, or an equal time? Now, this is an interesting question because I think it prompts us to consider the breadth of time. What do I mean by that? Well, if we think about the one coming to be, I think about the point at which we have that coherence. Again, the marriage between the principles that make it up. And we could say that this happens once foundationally, and then it continues. The contract of marriage is renewed, so to speak, as time progresses. Now, if it were to come to be for more time than itself, it would imply that there's this superordinate self that extends past the self that we're speaking of currently. Because without the transformation, we cannot say that an identity that is consistent with what we've been speaking of, like the one, can continue farther than itself or beyond itself, because that would imply an incapacity to change. Or maybe I should say, it would imply a capacity to change, but an incapacity to maybe maintain itself in the current form that it is, the current identity that it is. And so it's inherently nonsensical. There's not that strong relationship. If we say if it comes to be for an equal time as itself, there's an implication that of the total time that it is no more nor less. But if it comes to be, or is for an equal time, it is the same age. Now here my mind is thinking about the age of an identity from start to finish. It has that time for which it is associated to it. Now the concept that is being brought in here it's subtle and a bit confusing. For if we ask ourselves, is the one equal to itself in age? On one hand, it's obvious to say that it is, yes. But then we have all of this material about what we spoke of before, about the potential for it to have these identity states prior to the nounness. And those prior identity states are younger. And then relative to when we've decided to think about it, if we pick a middle point identity state, we can have the statement of the reverse, that there are points at which it can be older than itself. But now we speak of it as it is the same age as itself. And so it's not a matter of this relative before and after picking one identity state. It seems like, and nor perhaps is it, I should say. Maybe it is, but I'll have to explore this. The idea that now is the equivalent age versus the identity as a whole, as the equivalent age. The identity as a whole, as its entire existence, I think makes more sense than the here and now. But I suppose that there is some weight to be had with both, because I would say that I am the same age as myself, unless I'm considering this in some other way, as we've mentioned. And that which is the same age is neither older nor younger. No, it isn't, says Aristotle. So the one, since it comes to be, and is for a time equal to itself, neither is nor comes to be younger or older than itself. He says, is for a time equal to itself. And I have to wonder about that. Does this time just refer to the now? We'll put a placeholder there. And again, he continues, what of the others? I can't say, says Aristotle. This much, surely, you can say. Things other than the one, if in fact they are different things, and not a different thing, are more than one. A different thing would be one, but different things are more than one, and would have multitude. Yes, they would, says Aristotle. And being a multitude, they would partake of a greater number than the one. Doubtless. Now, shall we say in connection with number that things that are more or things that are less come to be and have come to be earlier? Things that are less, says Aristotle. So the least thing first. And this is the one. Isn't that so? Yes. So of all the things that have number, the one has come to be first. And the others, too, all have number, if in fact they are others and not an other. Yes, they do. But that which comes to be first, I take it, has come to be earlier, and the others later. And things have come to be later, are younger, than what has come to be earlier. Thus the others would be younger than the one, and the one older than they. Yes, it would, says Aristotle. So this is reminiscent of a place that we've been before, of speaking about others and the one in this separate context. So I'd like to go through this paragraph sentence by sentence. After this paragraph, we'll wind this episode down. And again, what of the others, he says? This much can surely be said. Things other than the one, if in fact they are different things, and not a different thing, are more than one. So a basic statement, but when he says things other than the one, if in fact they are different things, and not a different thing, which is an interesting distinction. So we're separating out the singular, a different thing, from the one, and then separating out many things from the one. And of course the basic statement is that these are more than one, because it's not just one thing that is different. A different thing would be one, but different things are more than one and would have multitude. So we understand this, basically speaking, introducing or reintroducing this idea of multiplicity and oneness, but in the form of the one as it exists based on its two parts, and then this multiplicity, however we're characterizing it as. And being a multitude, they would partake of a greater number than the one. Shall we say in connection with number that things that are more or things that are less come to be and have come to be earlier? The answer that Aristotle gives is things that are less. And so this idea is that moreness is a consequence of time, in a sense. And in a way, complexity is a consequence of time, where we have these multitude of identities that emerge based on more fundamental components. So the least thing first, and this is the one. So of all the things that have number, the one has come to be first. And the others too all have number, if in fact they are others and not an other. But that which has come to be first, I take it, has come to be earlier, and the others later, and things that have come to be later are younger than what has come to be earlier. Thus, the others would be younger than the one, and the one older than they. So before I end this episode, there's something that I want to talk about with regard to determinate features and how this maps with what we've been building so far. And I'm not sure it's all that complex or perhaps even useful, but I do know that when we were discussing the determinate realm, let's say, the older and the younger was one of those characterizations. And I have to wonder now, there were a few paragraphs into the introduction of time, how does this seem different? Well, before, I don't think I really placed older and younger anywhere, other than identifying that those terms are consistent with more of a determinate landscape. It's not very particular. It's quite vague. But at the very least, what we have is two concepts. One is the intra-identity, and one is the extra-identity. The number that expands out from one into something that is multiplicitous. And the idea that one is more fundamental than the greater number, than the two, than the three, than the four. And in this way, perhaps we can make an association with time, but at the very least, as we use the determinate terms, younger and older, that which is younger is associated with that which is more foundational, prerequisite to the unfolding of the subsequent numbers. Now, this intra-identity is something that we just spoke of. It is how we compare the older and the younger relative to one thing, the thing itself. And this, I think, we've discussed. So this is where I'm going to lead this episode, and we'll continue next time with part 18 of Parmenides.